Hi, everybody. Welcome today to another FotoFest Creative Conversation. I'm Stephen Evans, FotoFest Executive Director. But I just wanted to begin today by expressing our sympathy to the people that were affected by the tragedy last night at the Astro World Festival, especially to the relatives and the chosen families of people who were injured or sadly died last night. It's never good to wake up to that kind of news. And we really feel for all of our friends and Houstonians that were there that were, part of that. So there you go. It's a terrible situation. So we just wanted to express our sympathy. The whole team here and I. Today we're going to be talking about our exhibition, one of our exhibition artists, Ryan Hawk, and his work with Dylan Rodríguez. We're really excited to have them both here today. And this is part of the project that FotoFest has done in collaboration with the Texas Biennial. And I wanted to thank the Texas Biennial, Shay Little and Big Medium, and also the co-curators of the Texas Biennial that worked with our associate curator, Max Fields, on this project, Ryan Dennis and Evan Garza. And the FotoFest portion of the overall Texas Biennial is called In Place of an Index. And it's open for one more week. So if you have not had a chance to come by FotoFest and see the project yet, I really urge you to try to make it. It's open today and it will be open through next Saturday. So we really hope you'll be able to go and see the work in person. A lot of the work is very tactile and there are time-based pieces of video installation that are really terrific. And you may not have a chance to see this work again for a long time. So I hope that you will make it. And on that note, I wanted to thank the individual supporters of the In Place of an Index exhibition that include Lee Anthony and Travis Capps, Katie and Michael Casey, Ken Frederick, Carol Heron, Anna and Hal Holliday, Marcia and Mike Nichols, and Ann Wilkes Tucker. They are the members of the host committee that specifically came out to support this exhibition, and we really owe them a debt of gratitude. And I'd also like to thank FotoFest major institutional and individual supporters, the Brown Foundation, the Houston Endowment, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Texas Commission on the Arts, the City of Houston through the Houston Arts Alliance, the Eleanor and Frank Fried Foundation, the Philip and Edith Leonian Foundation, the Powell Foundation, the Wortham Foundation, the WWW Foundation, and the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, and as well our major individual supporters, Judith and Gamble Baldwin, Wendy Watrous and Frederick Baldwin, Katie and Michael A. Casey, Martha and David Moore, Nina and Michael Zilka, the FotoFest Board of Directors, and our in-kind donor, Silver Street Studios and Island Cloud Services. We couldn't do it without all of their help. So, and then lastly, in addition to Max Fields, the FotoFest associate curator that put together this great program and will MC the talk, I also wanted to thank the whole team and also specifically Brandon Harris, who's behind the scenes making it all work and getting the newsletter out to everybody. So with all that said, I'd like to turn it over to Max Fields.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And thank you to the audience who's attending this talk. It's sure to be great. And thank you to Ryan Hawk and Dylan Rodríguez for joining us and making, and bringing us inspiration and ideas. And I think you'll find that this conversation will be incredibly generative for questions from the audience. So stick around to the end. I'm going to briefly introduce the artist and author, and then we'll move directly into the conversation. Ryan Hawk is a Houston-based visual artist using video, sculpture, and site-specific installation to imagine alternative corporealities and forms of embodiment. Hawk has presented solo exhibitions at Gray Contemporary, Lawndale Art Center, the Umlauf Sculpture Garden and Museum, and the Museum of Human Achievement. His work has also been included in group exhibitions, screenings, and festivals such as Perform Chinatown, Los Angeles, Grace Exhibition Space in Brooklyn, the Museum of Fine Arts in Nagoya, Japan, Jonathan Hobson Gallery in Houston, and many more. Notable awards include an SMFA Traveling Fellowship, the Ark and Annie Giles Kimbrough Fund from the Dallas Museum of Art, and a 2-year fellowship with the core residency program at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. Hawk holds a BFA in studio art from the School of Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and an MFA in studio art from the University of Texas at Austin. Dylan Rodríguez is a professor in the Department of Media and Cultural Studies. He was named to the inaugural class of Freedom Scholars in 2020 and is president of the American Studies Association. He recently served as the faculty elected chair of the UCR Division of Academic Senate and as a chair of Ethnic Studies. After completing his PhD in Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley in 2001, Dylan spent his first 16 years at UCR in Ethnic Studies before joining Media and Cultural Studies in 2017. Dylan's thinking, writing, teaching, and scholarly activist labors address the complexity and normalized proliferation of historical regimes and logics of anti-Black and racial colonial violence in everyday state, cultural, and social formations. He conceptualizes abolitionist and other forms of movement as part of the historical collective genius of rebellion, survival, abolition, and radical futurity. What forms of shared creativity emerge from conditions of duress, and how do these insurgencies envision and enact transformations of power and community? Dylan is the author of 3 books: White Construction, Domestic Warfare, and the Logic of Racial Genocide, published by Fordham University Press in 2021, Forced Passages, Imprisoned Radical Intellectuals and the US Prison Regime, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2006, and Suspended Apocalypse, White Supremacy, Genocide, and the Filipino Condition, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2009. He was the co-editor of the field-shaping anthology Critical Ethnic Studies, A Reader, and has written in a wide cross-section of scholarly and popular venues, and has served as an editor or editorial board member for numerous journals and presses, including the recently founded publication Abolition, a Journal of Insurgent Politics. Dylan is a founding member of the Critical Ethnic Studies Association and Critical Resistance, a national carceral abolitionist organization. He is part of the Abolition Collective and Scholars for Social Justice, and continuously works in and alongside various radical social movements and activist collectives. He has appeared in a variety of broadcast media venues, including programs hosted by the Huffington Post Live, the Real News Network, and radio stations in Los Angeles, New York, the Oakland, San Francisco Bay Area, Montreal, and Santa Barbara. Thank you again, Dylan and Ryan, for allowing us the opportunity to speak with you today. And if you would, please join us on video. Brilliant. So let's kick this off. I'd like to start by asking each of you to provide us with a bit of background on your practices. I think this will help the audience immediately understand what led to the organization of this conversation today. And following this introduction, we can connect the dots, images, and discuss the shared interest in disruption. Interest in the circulation of discourse, images, and ideology regarding the aesthetics, apparatuses, and material manifestation and actions of whiteness, colonial violence, socio-political and cultural form and revolution, abolitionary politics, and among other complex ideas and issues. And Dylan, perhaps you could kick this off with a bit of background on your most recent publication, White Reconstruction, Domestic Warfare, and the Logics of Genocide.
Right on. I want to say thank you to Max and Ryan for having me participate in this conversation, and just say hi to everyone, in the Houston area and all over the place that's watching, participating in this event. I'm talking to you all from occupied Cahuilla and Tongva land in Southern California, city called Corona. A place of work is UC, University of California, Riverside, down the street from where the Riverside Police Department stole the life of Tyisha Miller in 1998, shortly before I started working there. I'm always humbled to be in conversation with artists, artists like Ryan, artists like folks that are in this community right here. And And so, yeah, I'm hoping I can contribute something to our collective praxis, our collective thought. And by way of introducing myself, well, thank you, first of all, Max, for that extended introduction. I didn't know it was going to go so far into my resume. I would have tried to interrupt you if I was a little bit more aggressive. But I'll say that by way of broad introduction to what I do, I have a pretty promiscuous affinity with all forms of radical and abolitionist praxis. Almost my whole adult life, 25 going on 25 years, I would say I've been directly involved and oftentimes in a supportive and a kind of solidarity role with various forms and politics of collective insurgency and movement, usually directly involved by different revolutionary traditions, Black radical traditions, hemispheric abolitionist traditions, anti-colonial traditions. Increasingly, I think in the last 20 years, radical and abolitionist, feminist, trans, queer traditions. I'm engaged with various forms of collective community and world making that try to confront and move against the particular conditions, I think, of targeted domestic warfare and genocide. Most importantly for me, in recent times, the forms of asymmetrical warfare that take place through criminalization, policing, and incarceration. I've worked with different organizations. Some of them Max already mentioned. I work with Cops Off Campus, which is at this point almost hemispheric movement to get rid of police presence at all university, college, and even K through 12 campuses. And what I'll say really quickly about my most recent book, White Reconstruction, is that, first of all, shout out to the late, great Clyde Woods, whose book everybody should read. Well, he's written multiple books, but you all should read his book, Development Arrested. Clyde is the one who encouraged me to write this book. And I'll say in a sentence that what this book is trying to address is how across kind of North American and US history, reformism, kind of movements toward reform, movements toward state self-correction in periods of crisis and heightened antagonism and insurrection and revolt, that reformism becomes immediately a strategy and a proliferating tactic of counterinsurgency. I'm interested in how the counterinsurgency works to restore the kind of dominance, the violent dominance, the supremacy, the global aspirations of what in the book I refer to as white being, which is something that is structured in coloniality and anti-Blackness and has the aspiration of global white supremacy. So that's the overarching concern I have in this book, and really in a lot of this stuff I do. I appreciate it. Thank you. I'm looking forward to this conversation, as you all know.
Thanks, Dylan. Ryan, perhaps you can give us a little bit of background to your practice for those who may not be familiar and are joining us today. And if you'd like, I can pull up images from the exhibition that you're featured in at FotoFest.
Sure, that'd be great, thanks. Similarly, I want to thank everyone for being here and putting us together like this. Everyone at FotoFest and the larger Texas Biennial, and everyone watching, thank you for tuning in. Especially thank you to you, Dylan, for agreeing to converse with me in this context, because your work is something, or it's work that I have read closely in the last year and a half. I kind of, through White Reconstruction, I became aware of your work in that way, and I have studied with and learned from, and to some extent kind of found affirmation in my work through some of the things that you define and theorize and kind of put forward and as propositions. So thank you for that. My practice, I should say, is first and foremost reflexive, and simultaneously discursive. And by discursive, I mean kind of materially and in practice, and that I'm interested in the kind of discourses of aesthetics and art making as much as I am critical thought and thinking. And the last 5 years or so, I have been going back and forth between projects based in moving image, kind of loosely I call like filmic character studies that kind of satirize this notion of universal subject and its subject of self-determination, and also what I call sculptural flesh objects, which are sculptures made out of silicone rubber that are pigmented and kind of treated, the surface is kind of treated to imitate to be facsimilies of Caucasian white skin. And I've been tattooing on them in multiple different ways. And in the past, outside of the kind of work that we're seeing now, it started as thinking about tattooing as this kind of disruption of this logic, this kind of liberal logic of raciality versus like the marked and the unmarked. And so thinking about the history of tattooing in an anthropological sense up until like modern times, where I'm sure we all kind of know that like there was this moment in kind of US or Western culture where tattooing was like a subversive or like a bad thing. And so this notion of someone like especially of whiteness like marking itself, of the unmarked being marked, and how that kind of spoke to this larger kind of framework and grammar of raciality, and also recognizing how like tattooing has somehow been expropriated from any kind of historical sense and is like presumed as this like white practice, this kind of dominant white practice, which it absolutely is not. And so the images that we're seeing and the relate to the project that I've made for this in place of an index in the Texas Biennial, which I have given the title Impossible Erasures of the Impossible. And it was a great opportunity to kind of focus this larger tattoo work that I've been doing, and I think kind of really get at what I've been wanting to for so long, because previously, I think you can kind of see over here, I've been making these pieces. I either have isolated images that I was like seeing online or that I would see in person that were kind of referencing actual tattoos that I would, that people would get. And as a way to kind of undermine this kind of irony and especially in as it related to the specific images of like of supposed pain or I guess also what I think about too is this logic of like an appropriation of a marginal position, and similarly as a concept of one marking oneself, of this idea of like taking on or appropriating some marginal position. So Impossible Erasures of the Impossible, I was kind of starting to become concerned or wanted to problematize this trend of blackout and tattooing, which I was kind of made aware of through social media, which is kind of increasing trend where people are tattooing large parts of their body, like covering it in black ink. Some people even like the entirety of their bodies, and how that kind of fits into this the kind of other structure and interest in the work too, of this approach encroaching on blackness from a white position, and how that kind of problematizes itself this this liberal kind of logic. And I think now I'll open it up because I realize I'm kind of talking in circle, like talking myself in a circle. So kind of let y'all come back into that.
Perhaps Dylan, you could offer your impressions and reaction and response to the invitation to reflect on Ryan's work.
Yeah. As y'all know, when we stage these conversations, we often have a preliminary dialogue, and that was my first time actually meeting Ryan. And I confess that I was looking at Ryan's art. I haven't had a chance to experience it in the tactile sense, so I had to experience it mediated, through a screen. Nonetheless, as I disclosed to Ryan and Max, I had to take a fucking break each, after each couple moments of working through these images of white, what I'm going to call right now, right for the purpose of this conversation, I'm going to call it white flesh. And it's not, it's only because I feel like it touched on a deep sense of vengeance and violence that I feel toward white existence. That's probably the main reason why I had to take a break. It wasn't because I found the images disturbing in the conventional sense of disturbing. They were not upsetting in the conventional sense of upsetting. They were inciting I would say. They touched a certain kind of foundational anger and rage and vengeance that I feel pretty much all the time, and which the world forces me to constantly discipline and patrol and police. So that's, I think, so ever since we had our preliminary conversation, y'all, like I've been thinking about, well, why the fuck did I have to take a break? Right? Especially given that the images are already mediated. Yeah, or sorry, the art is already mediated into a screen image. So it's like, what's wrong with me? But I'm slowly figuring this out. And what I'll say is that part of the artistic genius here that I see happening in front of me when I experience it is that, you know, well, Ryan, what you're doing is that you're showing us how it is that this preliminary contingent idea I'm putting out of white flesh, it actually has to be fabricated, you know, because in the current iteration of this world, there's no such thing as white flesh, because as I think, as I argue on, you know, carried by so many, an archive of people who have thought about this for decades and much deeper than me, right? White embodiment is already an ascendant form of being all the time. I mean, Hortense Spillers, right, famously and brilliantly thinks about how the Middle Passage kind of created and induced this notion of African flesh, right, as part of what I'll, you know, for now I'll call it the deracination of the Middle Passage, right? And I think part of what this art does is it shows us there's actually no analog. There's no analog to the making of African flesh, of Black flesh, in the institution of Middle Passage and kind of the unfolding of the carceral chattel institution in the Americas. There's no analog, and certainly there's no analog in the world of white beings. So Ryan has to fucking fabricate it, like he has to create it. And what I'll say about that is thank you, right? I'm indebted to you because I'm thinking about the productivity, you know, and also the kind of humility that comes with being pushed into an intimacy with that vengeance and rage and anger and hatred that I feel toward white existence all the time. This is what you did for me, right? It's also what you did to me. You know what I mean? I don't mean that in a pejorative way. It's like sometimes art does that to you, right? It does shit to you. Anyway, that's my working reflections, y'all. It's going to take me some time to really get myself around it.
Sure. No, I mean, I deeply appreciate that. Thank you, because it's the reaction that I kind of share. Similarly, like when I first made this work, this kind of, and I don't know if we have an image of it here, but the first impossible ratio of the impossible that I did, which is actually not a part of this series, it preceded it, right? Or what, you know, if that's even possible, was just a simple black square tattooed on like it was just a single one. And I mean, it almost like gutted me. Yeah, and so this is a recreation of that one, a similar kind of nod to it. And it took me a really long time to kind of, and I still don't think I fully 100% understand it in the way that I think making art never really allows you to, and you go back to that reflexive discursive thing. But it was really painful, and it embodied a lot of violence for me, and the simple kind of gesture that I feel like you kind of give some credence to there. So thank you for that. You know, and it also kind of tuned me into, like it put me on the search of trying to understand, which is, you know, just to recognize that the title is carefully borrowed and stolen from Fred Moten in a really kind of infamous essay called "The Case of Blackness," and which is published in Criticism Journal, but also I think in The Universal Machine. I think it was kind of republished in that book, and where it's this particular instance where he uses this term and thinking about this conversation between Ad Reinhardt and Cecil Taylor, who is a jazz musician and artist, and Ad Reinhardt, as many know, is like a kind of formalist painter and color-filled painter, and where they were talking about Blackness, and it was kind of quickly prescribed by Reinhardt as this very reductive kind of absence, lack of sight, you know, the void, and this kind of traditional larger dominant logic where, and Cecil Taylor tried to kind of intervene on that and ask the question of, pose the question of lived social life in relation to Blackness. And not to get into that too much, but the reason that it stuck out to me, and I kind of went back to it and decided that it was perfect for, as a kind of to encapsulate this project, is because I think what Moten meant by that was, the impossible ratios of the impossible, was to try to understand how it could be possible to mistake impossibility itself as an absence, as a void, and thinking about kind of cover-up tattoo of like the covering of flesh, but also not even flesh itself, but the other kind of images that could have been there. And in that kind of formal logic, I started to kind of see it everywhere, which it kind of introduces these other icons or symbols into the project, like the checkerboard, transparency, flag, kind of racing flag thing. And also through this, it allowed me to kind of introduce these eyes, to particular eyes in those images, which are actually emoji eyes, which I've tattooed, that not just speak towards the violence, but this, which Dylan, I think you kind of write about a lot and think about a lot, but the paranoia and fear that is maybe in kind of an embodied trait of white being, and so to kind of recognize that and to kind of attempt to deploy these mechanisms back in on themselves, back into whiteness.
Yeah, you just got me thinking about how, well, I want to ask you something, actually. I want to ask you something that comes from the comments the reflection you just shared. I'm going to assume something here. I'm going to assume that creating this work puts you in a certain place of vulnerability in some way, right? And I feel like that's a political project. That's an aesthetic project for sure. It's an artistic and aesthetic project, sure, but it's also a political project. I just recalled the other day. I just turned 48. My birthday is the first day of the John Brown raid, right? So I'm thinking about this all the time. I'm thinking about how, white comrades. I'll call you white comrade, right? Like, how does a white comrade like kind of imagine and create and then induce a certain kind of vulnerability? And what are the possibilities and limitations of that shit, right? Because part of what I think the anxiety is, the idea of is like knowing that there's a certain kind of impunity. There's a certain kind of structure of impunity that white existence constantly creates, reproduces, polices, and militarizes, right? And I mean it both in the material sense of institutionality and militarization. Absolutely, I mean it that way. I also mean it in the realm of the aesthetic, in the realm of what you were referring to earlier as the discursive, right? Like that shit is experienced as a form of police power that is as present as the forms of police power that we see, like on the street and on body cams and whatnot. So could you tell me if I'm wrong, right? First, tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm really interested in hearing you talk about how you mess around, play with, experience, disavow, whatever, the vulnerability that comes with doing this, right? Because this is what it signifies to me, is a vulnerability.
Yeah. No, I don't think you're wrong. And it's I'm like first, like I should just say, like first and foremost, like aware of the fact that like I have not in the past, and nor will I forever in the future always like be right, or like get it right and do it right. And I think I kind of had to like constantly re-deal with that, this like of this subject matter of getting into it and recognizing that I could very much fuck up, and that's just kind of part of it. And because that relates back to this question that I have from my practice all the time, but even in my teaching practice too, which I'm always kind of referring to as students, it's like, to what extent do we kind of reify or just like repeat the same kind of violent structures that we're supposedly critiquing, which is a conundrum of a lot of kind of let's just say anti-liberal practice. And, to speak to the work maybe even more specifically, like, actually, I'll say first, I've been trying to make work about whiteness and to get people to talk about this thing we call whiteness for like, not forever, but probably since 2016, 17, that like US political election. And so many times in having these kind of studio visits and critical conversations with people, I would be told a lot that it's like, I'm not supposed to be doing this, that it wasn't for me to talk about race, because there's, it gives into the presumption that whiteness is itself is not a race, which is a problem. But when thinking about that, it was often other white people who would say things to me like that, which is why I kind of allowed me to ignore them and keep going. And I think this project is also the same, because it's like I have to invoke a certain kind of liberal humanist logic to hopefully disrupt it, which is what I see the work is trying to do, is to kind of disorder that grammar, not fulfill it, but disorder it. And I think, also it's like there's a hesitancy among, especially within the framework of white liberal humanism, that like, you're not supposed to talk about Blackness. But I think that this work is trying to navigate the question of the impossibility of addressing one without the other, considering the kind of larger historical violences. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. No, you're getting at it, and I appreciate the fact that you're like, you embrace the fucking up. You know what I mean? Like, you embrace fucking up. Like, you're not supposed to get that shit right. It's a goddamn experiment. You know what I mean? John Brown didn't fuck up. People talk about the raid as having failed. Bullshit. That's fucking bullshit. It didn't fail a damn thing. It's like an actual model. It's a paradigm. It's a prototype. It's an archival tool. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And what you got me thinking about is this industry around white fragility. You know what I mean? You go to like Walmart and Target and you see books by people I will not name that are part of this kind of anti-racist industry that's dealing with trying to address and kind of in a weird way kind of domesticate white fragility, which I think misses the fucking point. You know what I mean? Like for me, when white fragility happens, it's evidence of a destructive possibility. Right, like when you experience white fragility, it means it's totally possible that something very good is happening in that room, in that moment, you know what I mean, in that geography. Like something is happening that is that is making certain positions experience violation and violence, right? Experience a certain kind of victimization, right? Which is the narrative. It turns into kind of, I understand where white fragilities come from. It's kind of narrative self-victimization that then kind of rallies people into this, dealing with like white tears all the time. So like, yeah, fuck that. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that what misses the point is how white beings should experience violence. And in fact, if we take the project that you're engaged in in its actual praxis, as well as in its possibilities, what it provides is a possibility to generate to proliferate that kind of violence to white existence, to white being, that is at bare minimum disruptive, anxiety producing. It'll fuck up your sleep. You know what I mean? Like maybe somebody will have a nightmare or two. Maybe they'll react to it in a certain kind of way. And the thing I want to validate is the fact that when certain white folks respond to something that is aesthetic or discursive as if they are experiencing violence, I think people need to stop acting like they're not. Right? People need to stop trying to say, well, you're acting out white fragility. This is really just equality or justice, or it's really reparative or something. It's like, no, let's actually honor the fact that there's certain aesthetic and discursive moments that in fact create violence against white being, and it should. Right? And it should. That's part of what I appreciate about this exhibit. Like, I don't know if some of the other artists I know would get away with it, right? But you're doing it, and I want you to keep doing it. I'm gonna use some of these images in pedagogical and political context, if you allow me to, if you're cool with it. to think through this, right? Like I want people to share how they experience these images of what I'm contingently calling white flesh, right? You've created and you've subjected white being to flesh making here in a certain experimental way. So I think that's where I'm at, and that's what I think this does for me, is that it tells me that it affirms for me the possibilities of cultivating an experience of violence for white being as part of an abolitionist project, as part of an anti-colonial project, and other kinds of projects as well, of course.
Yeah, well, as someone who has read your work, and specifically, white reconstruction, like I couldn't see how someone could read that and not take away from it that like the fundamental understanding that like white being and whiteness is kind of intrinsically is, if not just connected, but is violence, and so it's like there's this I think that's what I talk about in like turning in on itself, this like it's kind of like bringing into itself, so much as like kind of flattening, where it's not always somehow evading embodiment or invading objecthood. It's like to subject it to its objecthood would be to bring it to the violence that it already, by definition, when we look to people like, your work and the amazing kind of roster and bibliography of radical thinkers that, you cite or engage with, like it's there, yeah.
I mean, I'll just say just to emphasize that point. For me, it's like, it's always shout out to Sylvia Wynter's work, shout out to the late Cedric Robinson's work, shout out to Francis Fanon's work, shout out to the Black Radical and Revolutionary Archive, that really doesn't just inform my thinking, it actually structures all my praxis. So everything we're talking about here comes from some combination of those folks, and then I already mentioned the late Clyde Woods. So yeah, right on. I just want to say that out loud. That this is, whatever I contribute as a thinker and writer, it's at best a contribution to an already existing archive. That's my aspiration anyway. So yeah, I appreciate that, and I see your work doing something in direct affinity with this archive as well. Yeah.
I have a quote on my wall next to me that it's from Cedric Robertson. It's like, racism runs deep within the bowels of Western culture, which, if for people who know my work, would be like, oh, of course you have that quote. It's just like the kind of visceral,
that's right,
connection to it.
And it's like that constant reminder. I appreciate that, right? Because it's always something else when whatever work we do, and I'm thinking about our work as kind of part of this field of praxis. Right? What always strikes me is when the praxis that we're engaged in, ideally, if it's in a collective context, folks constantly come into revelation about that quote, right? That this shit it's like it's in the bowels of this beat. It's like it's not incidental. It's not a corruption. It's not a dysfunction of the civilizational project, right, of the US nation building project. It is none of those things, right? It is part of the bowels of the thing, right? It is hardwired into whatever analog you want to use, but it is hardwired into the thing. And so the moments of revelation that people around us have about that are, they're precious, and they have to be embraced, and they have to be kind of nourished. And at the very same time, there's part of me that has a kind of no shit Sherlock response. It's like, what the fuck took you so long? You know what I mean? It's like all the evidence, you are surrounded and inundated with like all kinds of evidence, anecdotal, statistical, artistic and otherwise, that has been telling you this from the moment you came into consciousness. So like there's something, I mean, that's part of what my interest is in work like yours, and in destroying a certain kind of persistent liberal humanism that always wants to disavow the fact of what is in the bowels. That what is in the bowels of the liberal humanist project is this, it's this genocidal beast, and genocide might not even catch it all, right? Like that term might not even catch it. I'm just using it. So I'm with you on having some shit on the wall.
Yeah, that actually speaks to like I think questions that I have for you, but like both, there's two, and that I has consequences of, like, to a larger discussion of aesthetics, and maybe like a kind of a negation of it. As if you think of someone like David Lloyd in Underrepresentation, where that book is like, oh, this is so powerful. But there's a certain kind of, which maybe you can recognize or not. I'd be interested in that, but I'm ready to call like anti-intellectualism that is, it's not new, I think to kind of like progressive, but like leftist circles are kind of critical thinkers. But I also see it like it's kind of spreading within this thing that we call like the art world or art community too, where there's this, and so, I'm wondering what you think about kind of a hesitance towards this type of study, and kind of, like, let's just call it study, and like how to deal with that, or just kind of your thoughts in it.
I have no fucking patience for that shit. Like anti-intellectualism is part of liberalism. Yeah. It's a central part of liberalism. And in fact, it's oftentimes college educated liberal progressive types that might refer to themselves as something to the left of that are the enforcers and the cops of anti-intellectualism. Now I'll say, on the other hand, there are, grassroots communities of folks who don't have privileged access to higher education, all that kind of stuff, who might be suspicious of professional intellectuals. That I honor and respect, right? And I'm like, yeah, there should be suspicion of people that have my day job. There should be, because the history of what people in my day job do is they expropriate, they commodify, they grift, and it's happening all around us as we speak. And I just hope I'm not one of them, right? I do my best to not be one of them, but I also realize part of my responsibility is to point out when people are doing that shit. Like, and I could go through a roster of names right now if I want. If y'all need me to, I'll do that. Call me, right? Yeah. So like, I think we need to differentiate between an appropriate skepticism and suspicion of people who are professional intellectuals, and it's not just academics, so-called academics. It's like attorneys. You know what I'm saying? Elected officials, anybody whose job it is, who gets compensated to think and generate what we call like knowledge or propaganda or whatever you want to call it, right? Like, there should be justified skepticism and suspicion of, until proven otherwise, of people in that position. Now, that is not the same as anti-intellectualism, which is what you're talking about. Anti-intellectualism is a hostility to deep collective thought, right? There are a few things more reactionary than that. And so what I'll say is that what informs me in my refusal to accept anti-intellectualism in any form. Let me back up. Sometimes anti-intellectualism gets conflated with this kind of, I'll for loosely call it the class suspicion of professional intellectuals, right? They get conflated. But what I've found is that can be disentangled pretty easily, because people that are serious about being in movement with each other there's a collective intelligence there. There's a collective smarts there. And folks can figure that shit out pretty quickly. And they know, like, people collectively know that this person, despite the fact that they're a professional intellectual of some kind, academic or other, whether academic or otherwise, despite that, right, their intellectual toolbox that they've had privileged access to can be weaponized for us, right? I'll repeat that, can be weaponized for us. That's what has nourished my praxis for 25 plus, almost 25 years, right? Like, is that feel, I'll call it feeling, right? It's because that's part of what it is. I don't want to privilege feelings, but like, it is a feeling when the folks that you're in community with embrace you in that way, right? And they're like, oh shit, we can put you to use for us, right? Like help us out with X, Y, and Z. And then you put yourself at the movements, at the collectives, at the communities, and sometimes individual people's disposal. I was just on the phone last night with some extended family members who have a loved one who is up for parole at San Quentin in about a month. And it's our first time talking, right? And we're thinking, but they're trying to draw on whatever expertise or knowledge I might have about the parole. It's very mundane shit, right? But it's like a minor iteration and example of what I'm talking about. Okay, so there's that piece of it that disentangles anti-intellectualism from a kind of appropriate suspicion of professional intellectuals. Now, let me go to the anti-intellectualism piece, right? The thing that has I think emboldened me to refuse any tolerance of anti-intellectualism. I'll give you a couple examples. One is back in the late 90s, right? When I was struggling with anti-intellectualism in actually multiple collectives that I was involved with, this is when I was in the Bay Area, San Francisco, Oakland Bay Area. It was actually people who are formerly and currently incarcerated, many of them political prisoners, unrecognized US political prisoners and prisoners of war, who confronted my anxiety about it and told me to just disabuse me of it, right? And we're also puzzled by it, right? Folks were like, what are you talking about? Like, why are people not willing to think analytically and theoretically in a collective way? Why are they not willing to read shit with each other? Like people, and this is people from like from a kind of generation of having been involved in many cases incarcerated for their involvement in radical and revolutionary movement. I mean, this is what folks were saying was like, this was essential to what we did, right? In our struggles, right? It was like essential. It's what kept us alive. So there was that piece. And then folks were actually like, I was literally sharing my most dense scholarly writing with people. You know what I mean? And like, there was nothing but generosity and embrace, you know, and maybe like some periodic requests for explanation and explication, right? It's like, all right, wait, you know, I didn't understand this paragraph here. Could you, I'm like, that's cool. I can do that, right? Like, so we're actually building community around study. So there's that example. The other example I'll give you all is this other community of insurgency that has generously invited me to participate, which is the Strike MoMA movement. You know, there's no more serious group of artists engaged directly in collective study than that group, than the Strike MoMA group. And the way in which they have kind of articulated this devastating anti-colonial, Black radical, you know, global liberationist critique and analysis of the philanthropic apparatus that has constructed the art world is completely transformed my understanding of how to work with aesthetics, with art, and how to confront all that, right? And again, it's about collective study. These folks are thinking densely and theoretically, like they convene study groups. I was in a study group with folks in Strike MoMA it was like a 2-hour study group, and we didn't even read anything together. We were just thinking about theoretical questions together for a couple hours. So I think we need to deal with that shit as what it is, which is it's a disciplining of collective thought. You know, on the other hand, collective study is an essential exhibition practice, you know, dimension of praxis. Sorry for the long response, but you got me going.
Oh no, that's great. Thank you. I very affirmative in that way, and I think we're kind of you know, I think I have so many more questions from that too, and it could go on for much longer. But I think we might be being kind of pushed into the Q&A. You know, so we have to, but excitingly open it up for questions. And if there aren't any, then I can get to the ones that just come up for me. But
well, we can also keep going, but I did want to make room. I mean, this conversation has been amazing and really insightful and thoughtful. Thank you so much. But I did want to make room and make sure that people in the audience know that you can, you know, ask questions to both Dylan and Ryan at any time. We're going into this, what we do at the end of every program, which is a Q&A with the audience. If you're watching on Zoom, you can enter your questions directly in the chat. If you're watching on YouTube, just under the video, there's a comment box and you can enter your questions and I'll field them from there. And just to kind of kick that off, I wanted to ask if you could each kind of reflect on the corporeal and aesthetic interaction that takes place in relation to both tattooing and also in something that you brought up, Dylan, was like the mediated image, right? Like you experienced Ryan's work through the screen. And I think that would be really interesting to hear about, like, both of you kind of expand on the importance of marking flesh, right, and the aesthetics involved in that, but also the experience of or the concepts surrounding and ideas surrounding the experience of such marking or violence through a mediated channel like a screen, through a mediated channel like the news media.
I can think about that, and I'm also interested in you know, culling some of these questions that are popping up as well. So, but yeah, maybe Ryan, maybe you can kick us off on response to what Max just posed.
You know, I don't know if I have a super profound, just to be honest, like a super interesting way that I think that I could answer that, in that, like, because the work is the work, you know, the materiality of the work, I think, like, I'm excited that the viscerality kind of is able to, in a practical sense, able to kind of transfer, you know, via this kind of mediation and then the documentation of it, but that there's this, you know, kind of a more, even more intensity in viewing it in person and like in the flesh, so to say. That, I mean, that I think counters this kind of, you know, desensitivity that we all kind of are guilty of continuing or feeling towards the constant kind of violence and murdering, specifically to Black flesh in the news media. You know, it's like so that physical experience is super crucial. Now, I think also in the films too, and that's one of the reasons that I don't allow my films to kind of circulate in their full entirety online too, because there's something about the physical installation that, like, I want people to leave there with that weight. You know, it's like, for me, it's the way that the work can communicate is viscerally. Like, if you can get in the gut, if you can get into those guts, that's going to go home with them, you know, in a different way. It's a different form of kind of counter knowledge, let's say. So I think that's my take on that. But.
And Max, can you put up that image of the Appomattox statue? And I'll think about that alongside what Ryan was just talking about. So y'all, this is a statue right down the street from where I grew up in Northern Virginia, in a city called Alexandria. I was the first person in my family born stateside. Both my mom and my dad were the first in the family to migrate from the Philippines. So this is where I lived, right? I was part of this Northern Virginia, what they call the DMV district, the district, Maryland, Virginia. I was in that area. And this piece of shit was about a mile away from my house. It's called the Appomattox Statue. It's not there anymore. It's not, believe it or not, I think it was an organization called like the Daughters of the American Revolution. It was one of those organizations that actually voluntarily took that statue down right around June 2020, because they anticipated that it was going to get, like, in their words, like defaced, destroyed, etc., right? Desecrated in their terms. But the reason I asked Max to put that up there is part of what Ryan's work and part of what his response just now gets me thinking about is this movement. I don't know if I want to call it a vacillation. There may be something more simultaneous than a vacillation between the fabrication of white flesh and white celebration, right? There's a constant celebratory aspect to the dominance of white being that is always overwhelming, you know, kind of every, not just every geography, but particularly its built environment. I'm interested in the built environment and how the built environment always includes a kind of celebratory aesthetic of a certain form of white celebration. So yeah, this is the Appomattox statue. It's like it is literally, or was literally, a celebration of Confederate soldiers right down the street from my house and down in what they call Old Town Alexandria. So you got me thinking about this as well in responding to the both the viscerality of the exhibit itself, but the viscerality of the experience of it, right? Like, I feel it in my viscera, is what I really mean to say. I mean that in a literal, like, I feel it in my gut when I move with it. And that's why I kind of put my positionality in there, because it's like I'm coming from a certain kind of biographical position that makes me feel it that way. And it's because of fuckers like this, right? It's because of statues, you know, it's because of the exhibitions and celebrations like this that are always kind of over determining how I experience something as jarring and moving as Ryan's art. So that's how I would respond to that for now anyways. You can take that stupid image down.
No, I think it kind of points to, though, the kind of spatiotemporal kind of logics of raciality too, you know, and that it's like it involves like space, which inherently involves time, and like these kind of like those statues were put up knowing that they kind of transverse time in this like grotesque, violent way, you know, and that there's one of the ways that it kind of inherently is built to kind of operate.
We have a question from user 93033, and this is directed to you, Ryan. Was there ever a time you thought about scrapping the flesh project, and if so, why?
I mean, I think about scrapping my entire practice all the time. And I'm like, what? Just to be truthfully honest, because it's, I mean, it brings me a lot of joy, and but it's also painful, and living is hard and it's expensive, and trying to operate in our world is difficult because you know, resources and money and are difficult. But specifically with the flesh project, I don't think so. You know, and if I'm reading this correctly, scrapping as in like putting it aside and not doing it anymore and moving on. I mean, I think I'm at this moment in my practice now where I've kind of gotten what I need to out of the methodologies that I've been enacting with in terms of these films, with these isolated kind of masculine white male figures under scrutiny, and the kind of sculptural flesh objects. Like especially with Impossible Riches of Impossible, I feel like I feel satisfied to a certain extent, but I'm also someone who problematizes, and like I see my practice as being one that is based on that, of like problematizing everything and creating problems. So that's just to say that I think I'm in this transition space where I'm starting to move beyond the specificity of white flesh, like materially, like not in terms of in the logic of representation. Like I'm becoming more interested in the institutional structures and apparatuses of whiteness, and in the way that they relate to this notion of white flesh. So it'll never go away, but I think it in the very near future is you know, going to grow and transform. So.
That makes me want to ask Dylan, what keeps you moving? You mentioned rage, but you know, I think like that's sort of like the participation in a system of violence, like day in and day out, when that occupies your thoughts and actions, praxis, it's challenging.
I mean, yeah, that's a really important question to ask ourselves all the time. Is because all right, on the one hand, I'm gonna say one thing, right? On the one hand, there is this kind of dominant liberal humanist notion that anger, rage, vengeance, and hatred are somehow unsustainable, and that they're not appropriate kind of sources of thriving. Okay, I want to challenge that, and I want to say that what moves me is being with people who share with me an endless reservoir of anger, an endless reservoir of rage, right? It will never go away. And I will say that the reason why it is endless is not, I don't think it's because I'm sick, right? I don't think it's because I'm unwell, although I am. Like I'm not gonna, you know what I mean? Like I am, like the world makes me fucked up. I'm unwell. I'm deeply unwell in certain ways, right? But it's not in the pathological, medical kind of sense, right? But the reason why that reservoir is an endless and bottomless one is because it's inseparable from the kind of love and affinity and feelings of grace that I have being in community with people who are fighting for some form of fucking self-determination, of freedom, of sovereignty, of safety, of security. Like those things are together for me, right? But I'll say, and I don't prescribe this for other people necessarily, but I'll say that what I am willing to be open about now, you know, more so than when I was still kind of subjected and to this kind of liberal gaslighting that told me that anger was bad and that rage was bad and that like I should, you know, act in a somewhat more respectable manner and like repress that shit all the time. Is that stuff needs to be actually cultivated and weaponized like all the time in community with people. So I'm not saying that this is an individual experience either. I'm saying this is part of being in collective insurgency and revolt and movement with people. That's what makes it endless, right? So Max, like that's what it is. I don't have this kind of, I haven't created a kind of, I used to have a different narrative to respond to a question like that. which was more about the latter part, right? Thinking about, all the inspiration and the, the love that I feel from these communities of folks, which is part of it. But I have to tell you, it's this intimacy with a certain violence in me that I think is indispensable. I think it's indispensable. I think it is what, permeates pretty much everything that I do, think, say, including the way I love, right? Including the way I'm in community with people. Like, that shit is there. And of course, like, the kind of challenge of it, the praxis of it is to constantly be dealing with it in a way that it doesn't immediately fall into all the reactionary and destructive and self-destructive and repressive and oppressive forms of violence that the world encourages us to act out and think and all that stuff, right? So that's how I would say this. And the reason I say it out loud nowadays is because I feel like there's other people around me who probably can relate to that, and maybe are not encouraged to allow their rage and their anger and their intimacy with violence to be something that sustains them, right? So I want people to come closer to that. I think that should be nourishing. It should be part of a critical praxis, and to do otherwise, I think, is to create a certain kind of unwellness that doesn't service anybody. I hope that made some kind of sense, you all.
No, I think it did. It's great. Is there another question, or can I ask one, Max?
Yeah, you can absolutely ask one.
Cool. All right. So, Dylan, well, just so everyone real fast, like, everyone should read White Reconstruction if they haven't, like, absolutely do, and work through it. But specifically the chapter on Goldwater's tattoo, and I'm sorry we don't have time to like get into like all of what's going on in that chapter, but you kind of mine these archives, just real quickly for people, you like mine these archives and kind of find something unexpected, which is this tattoo, which relates to this like really a fucked up performance, like, collective thing that Goldwater was involved with around a bunch of other kind of wealthy white men. But my question though about this is, I noticed actually recently, when I just kind of went back to the work to kind of prepare for this, I noticed that the tattoo itself, like an image of it, is not produced in the book, and I just feel like there's a really specific reason for that, and I'm wondering if you could address it.
There's multiple specific reasons for it. Like, one is that, okay, so to back up, y'all, like, Barry Goldwater, right? So I go to the Goldwater archive, trying to figure out how much of like a right-wing beast this dude was. So like, the chapter is all about these like unexpected things I found in the Goldwater personal papers and archive. And one of the things is that he was part of this like white men's group in Prescott, Arizona, called the Smoke Eye People, and they basically like did a form of white face, red face. Like, they conceptualized themselves as like honoring indigenous native people by creating their own little white tribe called the Smoke Eye. They would get like tanned, and then they would get these tattoos and create these fake ass colonial names for each other, and they would get tattoos. And Goldwater had one on his like the underside of his wrist, kind of like right here, as part of his being a member of the so-called Smoke Eye tribe, SMOKI, Smoke Eye tribe. So there's two reasons why I didn't reproduce that image in the book so much. Like, one was that he was really good at not being photographed. He's really good at hiding the tattoo in any kind of photograph. So I could not find anything in the archive that clearly showed the tattoo on his wrist. So like, one is just really easy. Like, I couldn't fucking find anything. And the second thing is that I was uneasy about exhibiting that kind of colonial aesthetic, right? Because I wasn't sure about it. It also just pissed me off, right? Like, it was too much. It was too much to kind of reproduce it in that kind of way. So like, put it this way: if I could find Goldwater's corpse and cut that shit off his wrist, right, and put in like staple it on a piece of paper, I might show that. Right. I'm not going to grave rob Goldwater. Calm down. All right. But I'm saying like in my imagination, in my strictly imagination, like maybe then I would exhibit that, right? And that's only because Ryan Hawk inspired me to do that shit. So blame him.
I'll just say, I got you, Dylan. So I can make this happen.
Oh man, we better watch out. This is on YouTube.
Just meant, that give me a mailing
Careful.
address and it'll just show up.
Getting us in
Not in
trouble.
the grave robbing, we're talking about the imaginary, which is like one of this potential here, right? That what I mean by I got you is like I can
I think we have a new
exhibit
collab.
this.
I think we have a new collab right here. I think we got something going.
Yeah.
Blame Max.
Yeah, FotoFest.
Please don't. Like he's our fall guy. Ryan, Dylan, thank you so much for this. This has been so much fun and really informative and generative. And I want to thank you again. I keep saying this, but I truly mean it. Thank you so much for your generosity of time, of energy, of thought, and for sharing that with our audience today and with those audience members who are watching this as a VOD on our YouTube channel. This video and this conversation will be archived on FotoFest YouTube channel and will be available to share publicly. So please spread the word about this talk if you enjoyed it. I'm going to put some information about where you can find this talk in the future and other talks that FotoFest has hosted, which I think you'll enjoy. The exhibition that this project or this event was held in conjunction with is called In Place of an Index. It's on view at Silver Street Studios in Houston through November 13th and is open to the public Wednesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. To 5 p.m. As Stephen mentioned in our introduction, it is only open for one more week, so you have only a few days to come and see the exhibition before it comes down. And also please reach out to info@photofest.org if you'd like to schedule a tour of the project or of the exhibition. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you, Dylan.
Yeah, this was
Thanks,
fun.
Dylan.
All right, y'all.